Hi, I'm Sanjoy back again. In our previous podcast, Davinia had given us an overall idea of crowdfunding. In the next 30 minutes, we will talk about not only how this new trend affects local entrepreneurs, but also incubators. We will also talk about how foundations can support this new development. Davinia, let's talk a little bit about crowd lending, because obviously that's a big one out there. Could you tell us a little bit about, tenure, interest rate, currency? How does a company raise money, and what type of money does it raise on these platforms?
Yeah, so you really have your two, archetypes when it comes to the platforms. So you have the platform's charm impact, and then Kiva's what they call the direct lending initiative. And so those two platforms provide $10,000 to $50,000 loans, and Kiva is the one that has no or low interest. Charm, their interest rates, I think, are typically sort of 8. Most of the platforms, the interest rates are somewhere between 8% per annum and about 12%. Kiva does USD denominated loans, whereas Charm does sterling denominated loans. As far as tenure goes, it really depends. It would be matched to, if the company, for example, is providing asset financing to their customers, then that tenure will typically be matched to that. What I often see is about 36 months seems to be sort of the average. I think the shortest I've seen is probably 12 months. And then for mini grids, that can go up to about 7 years. So there is really a wide range depending on the company model, and then obviously where the company is in their life cycle. Are they super early stage and just need like $10,000, $20,000, or are they in the growth phase where they need $500,000 plus?
Well, 3 years to 7 years sounds really encouraging, because that's the type of money that you would get from institutional investors. In fact, for many institutional investors, 3 years and 7 years is very risky. So, if you're getting that type of money on crowdfunding platforms, that's very encouraging. But I've also heard of a thing like a company has a campaign and then does multiple transactions within the campaign. Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, so there is a bit of a difference between, I guess, what the investor or the user sees on a crowdfunding platform and what goes on behind the scenes. So often a campaign will only be, I'd say the average is probably like $200,000 or $250,000. But many of the platforms, particularly those ones that are doing the much larger loans, they will approve. So the transaction will be approved, but that transaction might be, like you say, it could include 4, 5, 6 different campaigns. And the advantage of that for borrowers is that, often when you get a facility, say, like through a DFI or an impact investor, you have to draw down, let's say, your $1 million immediately, and then you start paying interest on that. With crowd lending, if you just need, say, $200,000 now, and then you need $400,000 in 4 months, and then you can just you can stagger your campaigns to match your funding needs and reduce the effective cost of capital because it's so flexible. At the same time, platforms, it needs to make sense for them. So often they will have certain, restrictions, like you have to raise at least 600 or 700,000 US dollars on a platform each year. But there is the possibility that, you might get approved, say, for a $1 million facility, and you might end up only needing to use 800,000 of it. And so that means, you're not paying interest typically on that 200,000 that you didn't use.
Okay, got it. So, you brought about Charm Impact as an example of a platform which really does low ticket investments or low ticket crowd lending. And I'm so happy because, Charm Impact came on our podcast a week back, actually.
Okay.
But you also said that, many of the big platforms are really not being able to support local entrepreneurs. Is it only because their transaction sizes are high, or are there any other reasons?
I think it's a number of reasons. First is, they have capital requirements. And so if there's already this trend in the sector before the entry of the crowd lending platforms, where there is such a concentration of capital within the top 10 companies, I think, when a crowd lender is doing due diligence on the companies, they're going to look to companies that have already attracted capital, because that to them reduces risk. So I think part of it is just the crowd lending platforms reflecting the wider trends within the sector. The other part of it, I think, is that, many of these platforms are based in Europe. They're not run by African entrepreneurs. There's one platform, the Wagenzi Fund that I mentioned in the Netherlands, that actually has an African founder. But so many of these platforms are they're based in Europe. And even their origination and due diligence teams are often based in Europe. And so I think that, that creates a bit of a distortion where you're just totally missing the opportunity. You don't have the connections on the ground to really become embedded in the local entrepreneurial ecosystem. So you can, have more companies in your pipeline and through the origination process. But the other part of it too is that you miss out, I think, on so much of that sort of local knowledge that is an important part of the due diligence process, that you're not able to, leverage the knowledge of people that have been working with these companies for several years and sort of know the ins and outs of the sector in that country, and also the ins and outs of the particular, entrepreneurs or the borrowers or investees. And so I think, it's the same thing we see with some of the impact funds, is that if you're sort of based in Europe, you might have, a very Western-centric view during the due diligence process. And then you're also not exposed to a wider range of companies within your pipeline.
So we're going to talk about, a crowdfunding platform which is not based in Africa, does not have any local connects, and we'll discuss how maybe they can be supported to do investments in local entrepreneurs. But before that, we do have two examples. Right? We have Charm Impact, and we have this Netherlands-based company which is catering to local entrepreneurs. I mean, you've worked in Nairobi and Kampala. If you were talking to local entrepreneurs in Africa today, how do you say they should prepare to launch themselves in at least these two platforms?
Yeah, sure. So I think part of it is knowing the market, knowing the players, knowing the different investors, what they're looking for, what's their ticket size, how many years of operation do they need before they'll even start looking at you. And what we generally see with many of the companies is that, it takes a good 12 months of just sort of having a relationship before the lender or investor will invest in the company. So I think, focusing on building the relationships and understanding the market and where, the different players fit is super important. The other part of it is making sure that, the record keeping system, your financials, your tracking of portfolio health and metrics is really robust. So, I think at an absolute minimum, lenders are probably looking at least 24 months track record. That could be further complicated, I think, because of the pandemic. So I think it's really important that, particularly if, I guess, you're having to work with non-African investors, if they might not understand the market. So I think as much as you can tell your investors about your customers, their ability to repay, if you've had to, for example, during COVID, if you've had to restructure payments, like, can you demonstrate that you've tried different approaches and that approach A didn't work, but approach B was really effective? So I think data, they're really interested in data and, having, I guess, your back end system be, open and accessible to them, so they can really do the analysis of your customer base, because that, is part of where the value of the company comes from. And so I think building up all those systems, even if you feel, you're not quite ready to raise debt or equity, I would be building up those systems from get-go, basically. The other part of this is using all types of capital that are available to you. Like, many investors, they will look for, particular ratios around, how much money have you raised from other sources. So if it's grants, making sure that you have the relationships with grant providers and understanding, again, what they're looking for, and trying to, get grants, which will increase the likelihood that you can borrow more. And at the same time, sometimes I speak to companies that, then they're sort of, I guess, put off by the small ticket sizes of some of the loans. But I do think something we underestimate is the importance of just building a track record with a lender. So I would be thinking, if I was an entrepreneur running one of these companies, is it worth me taking on a $20,000 loan so that I can demonstrate that I've taken on debt and I've repaid debt, and then maybe next time I get a $40,000 loan? And I think just building that track record really puts you in a really strong position when you begin discussions with potential lenders or investors down the track.
Very interesting. And then the flip side of the question is, how should incubators, because there are lots of incubators in Africa today, including Kenya Climate Innovation Center, with whom you have been in close touch with, how should they be preparing their entrepreneurs to take advantage of this crowdfunding trend?
Yeah, so I think understanding the market is crucial. Like, I brought up that example earlier about Waka Waka and the success that, Waka Waka and the company Gravity Light saw. And some of these, more donor-led initiatives, they sort of pick up on that and they see, oh, wow, look at this company, it's raised $1 million. We can now do that here in this environment. And I think, this is actually been published, so I'm sure they wouldn't mind sharing, but Kenya Climate Innovation Center a couple of years ago ran a sort of competition within the center where they hired outside consultants to select, I think it was about 5 or 6 companies to raise funds on Indiegogo. And many of the companies, I think, maybe, had overestimated what they could raise on these platforms. And the donors, I think, jumped in too early without understanding the market. And if you analyze the data from different campaigns, you can see that, like I mentioned before, like, these are really just a way to formalize a family and friends round. And so if you're using Indiegogo, say, and at that time, the only way to transact on Indiegogo is with, a MasterCard or a Visa card. And if that's a Kenyan company trying to raise money and all of their network is in Kenya and uses M-Pesa, is just completely wrong product market fit. And so I think, like, really understanding the market and not just thinking, oh, crowdfunding, that looks cool or sexy or whatever, let's do that. I think, spend the time researching and understanding what's going on the ground. And then if you still want to do something, make sure, it's the right fit. There are other platforms in Kenya. There's one that we work with called Mchanga, and they use M-Pesa, I think also, PayPal and Visa and other, payment mechanisms, but it's, fit for the market where your network is. And that's, I think really one of the big takeaways is the incubators not being superficial about things, like really understanding what's going on, getting their hands dirty and building something that's based on evidence and not something that just looks cool.
Absolutely. So I'm glad that you brought up this issue about incubators really getting deep into this project. But one thing I have noticed about incubators in Kenya is that their engagement with companies are like 6 months to a year, and they're very specific. They help them develop something, or they give them a grant, and then they're out. Do you think, with the crowdfunding, they need to be with the companies for a longer time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just speaks to probably one of the wider issues. It's not just about crowdfunding, but it's about incubators understanding their incubatees over the long term and really matching their support across the company life cycle. So ideally, I think an incubator should be able to work with a company that, has a few months of operating history, but likewise has 5-6 years of operating history. So I think it's really important to have the technical assistance in place across that life cycle. But likewise, it's really important that they have the access to finance. So I think the key thing for incubators is that they need to understand their companies, and let's remember these companies, are across many different products and business models. And so they need to understand those nuances within the company life cycle that could be, 0 to sort of 7 years plus. And so I think these incubator programs, rather than just being like a launch pad or something that, sounds great, but it doesn't really, other than like a quick upskill for the entrepreneur, it doesn't really allow an entrepreneur to like grow and cultivate their business. So I think that these incubators, while, they might run like a launch pad type accelerator within the incubation program, they should be really thinking about a minimum of a 3 to 5 year time horizon. And they need to, obviously provide the technical assistance across that life cycle, but also play, the matchmaking game across that time. So, early on, perhaps it's grants, maybe then it's concessional capital, and incubators could be thinking, how might we work with some of these funders that are serving early stage companies? How could we work with them to reduce the risk to the lender? So, they could create a sort of blended financing instrument where the incubator provides, some sort of subordinated capital or grant alongside the debt. And this means, that there's increased access to capital. But like I was mentioning before, it's also important for the companies to demonstrate, we haven't just had grants, we've had loans and we've paid them back. So I think it's, really important for these incubators to understand what's going on for the companies at year 1, year 2, year 3, not just this jump from, really small grants in the beginning to, a bank loan. We need to understand what happens in between that process and how we can be leveraging public funds to support access to finance from really early on.
Absolutely. But there are also, and you brought this up as well, the use of public money, but there are also foundations, private sector foundations and public donor agencies who are the issue about local entrepreneurs in Africa not having the same access to capital. How should they be thinking about crowdfunding to solve the problem?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really exciting, I think, that crowdfunding is now part of their agenda, because I know like when we started out in 2015, crowdfunding wasn't on the radar. And I think now that it makes up about 10% of all funds raised, there is increasing attention, which is really wonderful. But I guess, it also comes back to this thing of, do they really understand the market, or have they just heard that crowdfunding is growing, so they're doing something in crowdfunding. And again, that can sometimes mean that rather than it being like a market-led initiative where there's a really deep understanding of the market and the nuances within the market, within the business models, within the different jurisdictions, it can sometimes be a bit of a donor-led initiative. And that means particularly where the donors, lay out the design of the intervention before understanding the market, that it's almost like destined to fail. So one of the ways I've seen that is that, a lot of donors talk about what's referred to as match funding, where a donor financing alongside the crowd investor. So if a crowd investor invests, say, 500,000 pounds, euros on the platform, the institutional funder or, the foundation or DFI would typically put in, let's say, somewhere between 20% and 50% of the campaign target. But what this ignores is that many of the platforms, particularly those European platforms I was discussing earlier, those like investment style platforms, many of them have very high investor demand, and actually investor demand far outstrips the supply on the platform. Some of these platforms actually are getting like complaints from their investors saying there's not enough campaigns, or the investor has already invested in a campaign, the money has returned to their wallet on the platform and they want to reinvest in a campaign, and they just can't because the volume is just not there. So the danger with a donor, if they come in, without an understanding of all of these market factors, and they say, oh, we just want to do match funding, they're essentially crowding out investors. So it's really important to understand the platforms. I think match funding can be really helpful for some of these, smaller transactions, where particularly for platforms that are just launching, if they've only got within their first year of operation, I think match funding can be really important. But for some of these, larger ticket size deals on the more mature European platforms, match funding is not the right answer. So I'd really, urge donors to understand the market and the different types of platforms and what's actually needed to increase access to finance. One of the other things here too is how can foundations de-risk the investment products? So, they can look at what do borrowers need in a financial product? And then, what are the investors looking for? And remembering that these investors are just sort of everyday people. Typically, the platforms we're talking about, they generally live in Europe or the UK. Well, the UK is part of Europe still. And so there's, different ways that donors could support the innovation of products. And we've seen that on some platforms where they look at, different structures of guarantees, taking a subordinated debt position. But one of the big things here, which we haven't spoken too much about, but let's remember that the receivables or the revenues of the companies are typically in local currency, whereas these platforms are, and most investors are lending in euro, sterling, or USD.
Absolutely. I think, where foundation capital can really help is the point that you brought up. So the receivables of the company, or the borrower in this case, is always in local currency, Kenyan shillings, for instance. And whereas, if you have the borrowing in hard currency, then you would need hedge. And I think foundation capital can really help in absorbing this hedging costs. Have you seen anything like that already?
Yeah, I think a lot of the platforms are looking at this. I know of one platform that has offered unhedged local currency loans, where essentially the investors take all of the Forex risk. But more recently, we actually have a platform that we've worked with through the Crowd Power program, where they are setting up a local currency hedging facility just as a pilot first with TCX Fund. And this will be for a borrower initially in West Africa. And we actually hope to launch that campaign in the next month or two, which is super exciting. And in that way, I think crowdfunding is kind of, also setting an example of the types of product innovation that is possible within the sector, not just for crowd lending platforms or crowdfunding platforms, but for other investors as well. The other thing we've seen is that one of our partners is trialing, I think that there's definitely a tendency, I think, amongst these platforms to sort of do something small and test multiple options before scaling up. So another platform that we work with, they're trialing 3 different structures for hedging. So they'll probably try that with, say 3 different borrowers, and they'll take a look at, what are the different outcomes, what are the different costs associated with that, and how might they match the donors with these different products. Like, for example, if it's like a reserve fund that absorbs part of the FX risk, or if it's, a guarantee, maybe one donor or guarantee provider is more interested on the guarantee side. So I think it's, that kind of a bit of this matchmaking process and product innovation together that creates these, better outcomes and more informed products, and not just, jumping onto one solution before trialing, 3 or 4 to see which one is actually the best option here.
And that is the correct entrepreneurial way of doing things: experimenting, learning, and then scaling. Any other tips of what foundations should be doing or not doing?
So I think that they really need to know the market inside out. It's obviously, the businesses, the crowd lending platforms, but also some of the regulatory things. I've seen, certain call for proposals go out and they talk about particular markets like Ethiopia, for example, where it's actually really difficult for crowd lending platforms to operate. So I think, really understanding the different jurisdictions and not just trying to do something because that's a donor's mandated country. Like, they need to also understand whether it's a fit for them. And then, the other thing I think is really supporting platforms. Platforms often know the ins and outs of the different countries. So they should be like working really closely with the platforms and seeing, what can they do to support, say, the creation of a special purpose vehicle or other operations in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, so they can actually create more access to finance. So I think, really thinking outside of the square of match funding. And the other thing too, that's an important point, and I think, because of COVID, it's actually, one of the silver linings of COVID. I think it's really highlighted the importance of these platforms, these initiatives, not being run from Europe. I mean, they need to be run on the ground, and they need to have staff and people on the ground to not only understand the ecosystem, but, we're in a situation now with COVID where people can't travel. And so that really, would creates like a big disadvantage for companies that are based in Europe and don't have operations on the ground. So I would really be thinking about, how can you build the pipeline generation, origination, due diligence teams on the ground, so that you can ensure the continuity of operations when you have, shocks like we've had over the last year or so.
I think, thank you very much, Davinia, for helping us understand the entire gamut of crowdfunding. And I'm really excited that this will solve some of the problems, though I recognize that it's still very much concentrated towards the larger companies, but it will solve some of the African problems. So one final question. I know you have been in investment banking, you talked about this earlier, and then you have been now in crowdfunding and in emerging economies. Now you're going back to business school in Oxford. When you come back, how do you expect the world of impact investing to change?
It's a big question. Well, so I think that, there's definitely a realization within, different economies, governments, and the private sector that people are becoming, much more conscious about where their money is going. And that can be, like the products in your home, what you wear, but it's also extending now into financial products. And I think, this is something that we've seen with crowdfunding is, crowdfunding is really one of the only ways that retail investors can get access to these types of investment. So I think, it's such a huge opportunity that is currently untapped. And, the other, part of this is that by the end of this decade, 1 in 5 consumers are going to be based in Africa, and about half of them are going to be affluent or middle class. And so there's obviously, this huge opportunity there. And it's so important now that we're focused on building those entrepreneurial ecosystems and, understanding the market so that it's African companies that are serving these markets as they grow, which means that, the wealth stays within Africa rather than it being, outside companies coming in. So I think that, if we're really focused on not just for the issue of energy access, but how to build entrepreneurial ecosystems and create access to finance and services, like technical type services and technical expertise within these companies, that's just going to put, I think, the continent in a much better position to make sure that the wealth stays there so that it can be used to support things like, improved infrastructure, healthcare, education, and generally just creating exciting employment opportunities.
Well, I really hope that you can come back from business school in Oxford and build a great company in Africa, which will help, as you say, the wealth to be in Africa and put Africa on a sustainable development path. With that, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.